morning, everyone. I'm Allan Thygesen, and I lead Google's business teams for the Americas and also our global partner teams. I'm really excited to be here today with an old colleague and friend, Sukhinder, for a special talk at Google. So let me quickly introduce Sukhinder. As many of you know, she's a leading technology executive and entrepreneur, board member, and investor with 25 years of experience founding and helping scale companies, including Google. She was a very early and very important senior executive, Amazon and Yodlee. Most recently, she served as president of StubHub and as a member of the eBay executive team. She's the founder and chairman of the Board List, and she's been profiled in all kinds of journals: Fortune, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, Business Week, and the New York Times, among others. She's been named one of Elle's Power Women, one of the most creative people in business by Fast Company, and one of the top 100 people in the Valley by Business Insider, among many other accolades. She is the author of the recent book, Choose Possibility, and we'll talk a little about some of the themes she develops in that book. She lives with her husband and 3 children in Silicon Valley. Welcome, Sukhinder.
Hey, Allan. I am so excited to be here and to do this talk with you. It's like talking with an old friend.
I know. It's so great. It's so great. And congratulations again on everything and on your book.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start with how much I actually really loved your book and the themes that you develop in the book about thinking of risk as a series of smaller steps opposed to the big step and embracing it. I was wondering if you could talk a little about your journey to get to that theme. It's interesting to me that something that resonated so deeply with me, yet I had not seen it in any business book before. And it seems to be so endemic to the Valley. So what got you there?
Yeah, well, first of all, as I said, excited to be here. I think this idea of taking little risks and sort of being imperfect and, continuously improving your product, like it's so accepted in the Valley, right? So by the way, when I wrote the book, when I sold the book, I was like, is this even a new idea? Because we are also used to it in the way we think about building products. But when you think about careers, I think something very different happens for people. I think when it comes to personal choices, people tend to celebrate what they see from the outside in about somebody else's career. And they often think it's one big and mighty choice. I'm sure you get a lot of credit for the great choice you made in joining Google.
Yeah.
I get a lot of credit in my career, and people think it's just perfectly orchestrated. And I often say when people would ask me, like, what does it take? They think it's like one move I made. And I often just want to say, do you understand? Like, my career was just because I kept choosing, like through failure, through success. I just kept choosing. Like, that's it. If you just keep choosing, I guarantee you can accumulate outsized success, but you have to actually kind of be in this continuous act, right? Of of choosing possibility and taking risk. And some will fail and you'll accumulate a lot more. So I think what led me to write the book was really the sense that people will always ask me and sort of impose this belief from the outside in that it must be true that one mighty choice has made a career, right? And mostly I'm like, honestly, it's the act of continually choosing and repeatedly choosing. It's almost the number of choices and the frequency of choices than a single choice. And I don't know why we don't apply that to our careers, but that's the truth. So that's why I wrote the book.
I think that's so wise, and I totally agree with that. And I love that you were being vulnerable about your failures in your book. And I when I meet with new employees or groups of employees, I often talk about the failures in my life. And I was part of a bankruptcy early in my career. I started a company that failed, I think, much like you admitted to doing. And it humanizes us, but it also, I think, gives permission for people to do that. And I think at Google we have a lot of people who haven't failed very much or at all in their life, and nudging them to take risks, which I think Google does well for a large company, very well indeed. But there's still a hesitancy there. Everybody thinks that you need to achieve perfection. How did you talk a little about how you overcame failure? Because I think that's a big part of what holds people back.
Yeah, well, there are 2 ways I overcame it, but I think one of the things you hit on, which I think is really important for people, one of my biggest failures came right off the back of leaving a very successful career at Google. And I'll certainly go through that in a moment. It was certainly one of the most painful failures of my career to leave a very successful career at Google behind and take a risk that did not work out. But I think there are 2 ways I've sort of tackled failure. Number one, I grew up in sales, and I always say to people that there's no better career for learning how to take little risks than sales, because
Right.
by its very nature, right, you have to put multiple fish in the water at any point in
Yeah.
time with the expectation that 9 out of 10 don't work out in order to get to the one that does. So it's like the very, I'd say definition of sales, maybe other than at Google where AdWords sells itself, no offense. Um, in sales, you really do grind it out. So I'd say the first way I learned failure is honestly by taking lots of little risks on the job, and that indoctrinated me to this idea of people, saying no to me or something not working out. And one of the tips I often give people is like, if you want to take a big risk later, you've got to start by taking lots of little risks
Yeah.
today. And I can give you 4 or 5 different reasons to take a risk. People think there's only one to achieve something
Right.
large. And I'm like, actually, you can take risk every single day with your time and energy just to have a little bit more impact and see what happens. So that's the way I would say that's the normal way you learn failure, I think, is like take lots of little ones and get indoctrinated. It's not that painful. And then there are the painful failures. And the irony of the most painful failures in our life is we become a lot more able to take risk
Yes.
after a painful failure, right? And you say, why is that? And it's simply because, there's something to the act of recovery from small failures. The recovery from a large failure, nothing sort of trains you to put risk in perspective and actually nothing gives you more confidence than recovery from a large failure. And,
That's right.
I know in your pre-questions, you sent me this note. You said, well, what's something you've never told somebody? Like, people have always imagined me to be kind of the most secure of individuals. I was probably at my most insecure at Google. Like, let's
Yeah.
just think about that for a moment. I was at Google, as
Yeah.
you know, from 2003 to 2009. I, worked on local and helped build that business. And then for most of my career, I built our international businesses outside of Europe.
Yeah.
And I was at the pinnacle of my career. I mean, I was, I had ascended. Look, it
Yeah.
was just an incredible time. But I was so like, with more success, I was just more insecure. I find that ironic because I had, I obviously had this great track record. Yet all I could do is constantly compare myself and my choices to my peers. And you know who those peers were. I mean, they're
Yep.
like just incredible people.
Right.
And it was only after I left Google, and as I noted, I went to a startup. I took the risk to pivot into e-commerce. I took the risk to be a startup CEO, and I chose one specific company, Polyvore, after doing incredible due diligence. And within 6 months, the founder and I battled for control of the company. We didn't even battle. He basically said to the board, I want it back.
Yeah.
And despite my track record, and despite the board telling me they
You're
loved
right.
me,
Yeah.
they picked me. They picked him. They picked him. Like,
Yeah.
I was like, how is this even possible? And all my worst fears, keep in mind, I left Google, took the risk, highly insecure of what would happen if I failed, but I took the risk, and then I failed. And publicly, I was like, people are like, you ran a multi-billion-dollar business and you couldn't even win a battle for a 20-person company. Like, what is wrong with you? But I will tell you, like, the recovery from Polyvore was the singular biggest confidence builder in my career, right?
Right.
And we'll go through the journey. Many choices later, I ended up as the CEO of StubHub, but that choice set, that string of choices started with the decision to go to Polyvore. And so, so there's nothing like recovery from a failure to train you to be able to take more failure. And so, believe me, I'm not saying to everybody go fail big. I'm just saying, hey, do a bunch of small failing, because guess what? It's pretty easy and you'll get indoctrinated quickly. And then at some point in your life, when you have the big fail, because you actually took a big risk, be thankful when it fails, because your confidence levels afterwards are kind of off the charts.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And you prove to yourself your resiliency and your ability to bounce back, and that gives you more confidence to take more risk. So before we move on from Google, maybe is there a nugget of knowledge that you've taken with you throughout your life from your time at Google?
Yeah, there are many, but I'm going to pick the one that most applies to this concept of risk, which is 70-20-10. I don't know if does Google still use that?
It's in the water, but we don't think we explicitly talk about that framework.
You don't, right? So in my era, Google and Eric and Larry and Sergey introduced 70-20-10 because everybody at Google wanted to let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? So everybody's working on their own pet projects, and there's no ability to prioritize resources. But let me tell you what I love about 70-20-10, even as it applies to our lives. So I do take it everywhere. I am somebody who has parallel dreams. Like, And I always say to
Before
people,
you go, let's just explain 70-20-10 real quick.
oh, sure. For people who don't know it, it's this idea that you spend 70% of your resources on the core business, 20% on the adjacent business to the core. So in my time, that would have been things like maps, and even YouTube was adjacent to the core, but not the core. But they're going to be your next bets, but they're pretty close to search. Search was the core. And 10% was moonshots, like whatever you want to do, right? So if you think about 70-20-10, but apply it to your career, we all have applied even to a job choice, a job search. We all have multiple strata of dreams, right? And sometimes we want to live in all the possibilities. I want to live in the possibility that's safe, and I want to live in the possibility that's a stretch. And so I would say to people, like, pipeline in parallel, like, go after the safe, go after the not so safe, and go after the dreams all at the same time, because I'm not actually requiring you before you take a choice to give up anything. Why don't you literally play all bets forward? So when I'm making a choice, I think of 70-20-10 as like, I have the right to, pursue the most safe, to literally the moonshot, and keep them all in, like, going at the same time, because that's how I want to know that I've seen every choice and explored every choice. And then, everywhere I've gone, even once I've made a choice, how do I deploy my own energy? If I deployed all my own energy at the core, like me personally, I don't know that I would get enough joy from it, because I live in growth and innovation, right? Like, that actually gives me happiness personally.
Yes, I totally agree. And actually, I think there's a lesson there for companies. If you want to attract good people, you got to give them freedom. And with that freedom is you're going to have a little bit of chaos, but it's okay, because the cumulative benefit of all those individual choices and of embracing innovation and embracing risk-taking is that the company performs better and you get better talent. And
that's right.
So it works not just for individuals, but it
works for companies. But what I find, you said, why did I take through my career? I've definitely used it at every company to help, create a portfolio of choices, because at most companies, they're not Google, where the core is growing at 20%. Like, the core is often growing at 1 or 2%.
Maybe so it's not throwing off quite as much cash.
Yeah. Okay. Right. But, and you have to make these choices. But I think the most intriguing thing about that for me at Google was, it's also, to your point, it's also something you can do as an individual. And it allows you to live in all of your dreams. And by the way, like I said, if you're making a choice, you may be going to work every day and that's your 70, but you may be, you may have an Etsy store and that's your 20. And guess what? Maybe your 10 is one day you're dreaming about a book. Like, you can hold all of these goals over different choice sets and time sets and hold them at once, right? It is possible. You just can't do them all at once.
So let's pivot. You mentioned that your most recent big gig was leading StubHub, and you and I spent quite a bit of time together in that role, and which you ultimately sold StubHub to one of its competitors for $4 billion, which is obviously a fantastic outcome, which I'm sure eBay was thrilled about. Couple of points there. So StubHub was a bigger company. I think in your book you also references there was a lot to do, and it wasn't a gimme that StubHub was going to become the largest player in the ticketing space, in the secondary ticketing space. But you were well positioned, and you led it, I think, incredibly ably. And then, with thinking you were not taking risks, you ran into COVID, and I can't think of a sector that was much more negatively affected than ticketing. And so I can imagine now you had already closed the sale, and so you were a little insulated personally from it, but still you were leading a company at a time of just incredible 90+% change in the external environment. Talk a little about that and how that felt.
I think you hit again, this is what I mean, that our lives move in cycles, and we think we're not seeing the same movie. You're just seeing the same movie at a different scale at some point. So the StubHub saga, it was an incredible company to run, to your point. But at the end, you sort of identified two things that happened. Number one, we had what's called by researchers a coconut event. A coconut event is the type of event that you can never predict. It has an unknown volatility. Like, it's volatility you can never, like this,
Black swan.
Yeah, it's a black swan event. And so it's the same as a coconut dropping out of the sky and hitting you on the head and killing you. That's literally what a coconut is. So this risk emerges that, to your point, I never foresaw. And to some degree, I thought I was done with risk because we sold the company. And the real risk for me was like my career risk. I was like, great, we were acquired, not, we didn't, we were the buyer, we were sold, not the buyer. So I was going to be in a new job ultimately. The CEO would take over. So I was coping with like personal kind of sense of like, gosh, I'm disappointed, but professional success. And then COVID happened and I was still the CEO. And on the one hand, you said I was insulated, but the most scary thing about the StubHub time, honestly, was because we had just sold to another private company that also had limited cash on its balance sheet. I literally remember at the beginning of the week, I was telling the team, we were forecasting 50% down on like March 7th. And I was like, maybe we should create a scenario for like 50, 60, 70. And by March 13th, every league and, event was postponed and we were down 95%. And because we were no longer owned by eBay, when we were owned by another private company who has limited resources, and we were upside down on hundreds of millions of dollars in consumers wanting, refunds. We were actually looking at potentially being bankrupt. And I was like, okay, first of all, this is surreal. How is it possible that a month ago we sold the company for $4 billion? And honestly, Allan, at that point, I was like, don't I have the right to just like sail off into the sunset at this point? Like,
I can imagine.
and I'm like, and I remember, I was like, how am I holding the bag? Like literally, like, how can this be happening? And then my very next thought, was I was obviously really worried. I did thank the Lord that I've been an entrepreneur before, because this company's going to have to pivot to managing cash overnight from a company that hasn't known how to manage cash for 15 years since it was, sold to eBay 10 years ago. And so I think that two learnings came out of that. Number one, the company's agility, agility I was trying to teach our company when times were good. I was trying to teach people how to do faster OKRs, how to plan for more volatility, 70, 20, 10. And we were moving along. And then overnight, I think the company realized its own agility. 100% of our employees weighed in. We restructured the company. We cut our burn by almost 70%. And we had to do that inside of 30 and 60 days. We, restructured all employees. We actually launched a credit policy on the site. We couldn't give refunds. We had hatred everywhere, but it was like a question of survival. And what that taught me is, of course, in survival mode, people are far more agile than they think. And I saw the level of agility I saw from our employees inside of, a week versus the agility I was trying to teach for the previous year and a half. There's just no comparison. So my first learning is the learning everyone's had in COVID. We really realize how agile we are. And it's interesting to see how much risk we will take to avoid harm versus the risks we are unwilling to take every day when times are good. So I think this is like the biggest irony of COVID. And I saw it. And then number two, I think, like, of course, like everyone, I had fear. I had some confidence because I had been through those cycles before as an entrepreneur. And mostly, honestly, I had a level of just unbelievable pride as a leader in how much people mobilized when it meant cutting their own jobs to make sure the company survived. It was just a moment of, as a leader, where I was just incredibly proud of the entire team.
Yeah, it's so impressive. And I agree. I mean, these crises tend to bring great clarity of purpose and more agility. And even at Google, we saw that as well. And I'm incredibly proud of how the teams responded during that time. That second quarter was surreal.
It was surreal, wasn't it? It was surreal. I should have just called Google for a loan.
I mean, even a company that had never seen a revenue decline, dropped. I think our growth rate dropped 30 points. In the span of
it was just
2 weeks.
it's hard for us to all imagine.
Incredible. So while we're on COVID, obviously has triggered a whole revolution in how we work. Talk a little about, working from home, remote work. Where do you think that's going? Do you think that these hybrid models will work? Where do you come out on all that?
Well, first of all, it's interesting. I'm the lead director at Upstart, which is a fintech company that's public. I'm sure it's also a Google client. And Dave Gerard, by the way, is another ex-Googler who's the CEO of that company. It's got its own ex-Google crowd. And Jeff Huber just joined the board, so lots of ex-Googlers there. But my point is that Dave is, excellent CEO. And he actually created, and I think this is very indicative, so I'm going to answer your question. He created a back to work model that was the first of its, really well articulated, and he posted it on LinkedIn, I think earlier this year in like May, just so other companies could use it as a model. By July, he had posted the entirely opposite message on LinkedIn, that after creating a back to work plan, he and his co-founders sat down and, when challenged by employees, thought about it again and again and again. and then posted an entirely virtual work plan. So here you have a very talented, capable CEO who creates first a very thoughtful plan for everybody to come back to work, how they come back to work, what's the hybrid model. 3 months later, like says, no, wipe that whole clean. Now I'm going to a whole at-home model. I guess my belief in this moment is, you know, there are companies that want to define total clarity for their employees,
Yep.
and I think what we need is a plan for more volatility. I
Yeah.
have to say, like, I think Delta has now thrown a wrench in everybody's plans for the fall.
Yeah.
So what I think is that I think the company showed remarkable agility in what, and so did employees in creating flexible and highly productive work. And then I think you have people who are almost, want to pivot back to like what it's going to be. And the world is just telling us again and again,
That's
like,
done.
hey, you know what? I know you want to just lay down like what it's going to be. Like, here comes yet another, like, wave 2 of the black swan. It won't be quite a black swan, but let's just
Right.
call it an orange swan, whatever we want to call Delta. But I think what it's telling us is you have to be, I think, still pretty flexible as an employer on what this looks like. And I think all these folks who are, I know lots of people are like laying down the mantra, hey, if you, and I don't want to insult Google or anyone else here, if you move to this location, we're going to adjust your salaries. This is going to be the plan. And I think the world is telling you, like, you might want to hold your horses on trying to like impose a new structure. I think that
Yeah.
I think I think workforces need to stay pretty flexible. And conversely,
Yeah.
I think when your employees are kind of telling you what they might need, this is the time to still be listening, because
Yeah.
I don't think we're ever going back to the way we used to work. And I think you have an opportunity to really reshape and redefine, and maybe weirdly stay agile. Like, maybe
Right.
you don't need to lock yourself into a model. That's actually, I think if I was a CEO right now, I would be hesitant to lock myself into a model.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is also about the individual roles and the choices that you empower employees to make. And so we've done a lot of that, right? Various employees can apply for remote status, they can apply to transfer to different offices, and the baseline has moved tremendously from expect to be in the office all the time to more of a baseline of 3 days a week for people who are in the office.
Yeah.
And so that gives a lot more flexibility for people, and they can work in other places, 4 weeks a year, and so on. So we'll see where all that settles out. I agree. It's very hard to predict exactly where things settle, and I think agility is super important. Let's pivot to talent. So you are known for breaking barriers and for speaking truth to power, fostering talent. So I'm curious, what's a piece of management advice that you see repeated over and over that you actually completely reject?
I'll tell you, I think the piece of advice I really reject is that great leadership is about great management. And so people are like, well,
What do
what
you
do you
mean by
mean?
that?
Yeah, exactly. What do you mean? Right. The wisdom that we grow up learning when we, go from individual contributor to manager, manager to senior manager, leader, is that our power comes from how well we can manage people, right? How well do you manage people? How well do you direct them and guide them? And in my career, what I found is people want to feel that they have autonomy, vision, leverage. I, as a leader, want to feel like I have autonomy, vision, leverage. We actually both want the same thing. The people who are working for me, the people, we all want the same thing, right? So what I say to people is, I would much rather a world where you manage me than I manage you. People are like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, let's just think about it. If I spend all my time managing you, that means I'm likely telling you what to do, telling you what I think is the right thing to do, structuring our agendas when we meet. And what I say to people is like, if you're coming to me, if you come with a blank slate, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to fill it in. Now, you may not like the way I fill it in. And that's a risk to both you and me. But I can tell you, if give me a blank slate, I have an opinion on everything. I'd rather you come with your slate. Really, truly. Like, if you come with your own slate and your canvas 75% filled, here's what happens. You take control of the conversation with me. That's a good thing. You've had a chance to think through your own vision and present it, but still want my feedback. Oh, that's a good thing. I get to have some input. 3, you didn't give me something that's so baked that I have you expect me to have no opinion. Yet it's your framework in your canvas in which I can give you, insight. And guess what? I, as a leader, get to move on, and I get to work on the next new thing, which gives me a lot of energy. So I would much rather you manage me than I manage you. So if you think that the definition of a great leader is that you must be managing people tightly, what I reject is the construct that, great leadership is about great management. Great leadership is about great leverage for both
Yeah.
parties
Yeah.
and authorship for both parties. And I think that happens when we ask people to rise, right, and anticipate and, identify their vision first. And that doesn't mean you have to be an extrovert. It just means you take your canvas and present it, as opposed for waiting for somebody to tell you what the canvas should look like.
Yeah, I love that, and I totally agree. I mean, and certainly, if you're a senior leader, if you feel like you need to micromanage your leaders, you have the wrong leaders and the wrong idea of management.
But it is
But it's
interesting
true
that
at every level.
I would say that a lot of people spend their time,
Yeah,
including leaders. I see leaders who
yeah,
think that their leverage comes from like how tightly they manage their teams.
yeah.
And I'm like, I'm not so clear, because I think your teams need you to draft ahead, right? And go to the next frontier. And they want to draft behind you, and they want to be in your job, by the way. And there's
Yes,
nothing wrong with that, right? And you
right.
should want to be in like, you want to be, around the next corner.
Totally agree. So, speaking of managing your team and motivate, let's say coaching your team or nurturing your team, how do you model healthy risk taking?
Well, you and I were chatting about this before we went on camera. I think that despite what we say about, feedback loops and
Yeah,
all of those things, I think most people really do worry about looking perfect.
yeah,
And I think they worry about looking perfect for two things. Number one, they want the respect of their teams. And
yes,
number two, even to our own egos, right? Like when we look at our own imperfection, it's painful,
yeah,
by the way. It's painful for me as
yeah,
well. But when you model perfection, you don't give anybody else the license to be imperfect. So
right,
I will say to people, like, this about me, and
yes,
I am very passionate. I'm also very emotional. I am embarrassed by how often, for whether it was at Google or at StubHub, you can get me to tear up. Like I can tear up in front of 4,000 people, 400 people, 4 people. And there are lots of times I'm quite embarrassed by my emotion. But the times I'm not embarrassed by it is the times I know that it gives other people license
yes,
to be, and we use the word vulnerable, but it gives other people the license to be imperfect too. So I would rather claim my imperfection if it gives you the license to be imperfect, even if it's embarrassing for me that I always do that. It is. It's not like I love it. I would love to look perfectly, packaged, and not kind of
yeah,
not let the tears show, but that's what happens. But I understand that imperfection gives people license. So I think model imperfection. Number two, and this is an important one, we press our teams for plans and plans and plans. And let me tell you, when you press your teams for plans, planning will extend to the amount of time you give it. And when you press people for plans that have like all they want to
yeah,
do is more perfectly identify an imperfect thing, which drives me bonkers. I'm like, okay, you can add more detail to your plan. You can't actually take away the inherent volatility
yeah,
of a set of outcomes. I would
right.
rather you create a model with your teams where you plan for volatility. What would happen if you gave your teams license to plan for
I
volatility?
couldn't agree more. In fact, we over time we have cut back our annual planning process
Uh,
more and more,
right.
and almost eliminated sort of this massive bottoms up planning exercise that ends up not moving the needle very much and is obsolete a quarter later and consumes and distracts enormously while it's going on. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have some high level themes,
Exactly.
but
Absolutely. But
trying to micro
people
plan a sort of a
micro
5 year plan
planning is
is
awful. It's
it's a
awful.
problem. Yeah, I
Yeah,
couldn't
and
agree
I
more.
see it in OKR planning, at almost every company I've been in. And because
Yep,
the more detail people put into plan, it sort of gives them a false sense of certainty.
yep,
And then they just keep planning for the upside. And I'm like, what you really want to do is just have, to your point, give me a top level plan. And then you want to give your teams room for the volatility. So they're
right.
really spending more time responding, and they can
Yes,
have the permission to give you a range,
and
which most
focusing
people,
on articulating the outcomes you desire, and then
you
let them
got it.
fill in how to get there. Yeah, I couldn't agree
Yes,
more.
absolutely. That's a big
So
one.
on the encouraging risk taking, so can you give an example of a career risk you took that went awry, and how did you pivot using that to your advantage?
Yeah, look, I think that actually there's one more tip I want to come
Yeah,
back to, if that's okay, on what we need to do with our teams. And I think we often think of ourselves as doing this, and I don't think very many leaders do. Um, we rarely step out of author and into publisher mode. And what I mean by that, if you want people to take risks, Just think about it. Are you the person? I know this happens to me. I'm in a management team meeting and everybody turns to me for my opinion and I give it, right? If I give it first, how much room for authorship is there in the room? Not
Yes.
that much, right? By the way, as leaders, we do it all the time. Like, I literally have learned that I need tactics to move myself out of author into publisher mode
Yeah.
if I want my team to take the risk to speak truth, to take the risk to articulate their own vision first, instead of like waiting to hear what I say and then like, agreeing or, or validating it. And so like, I will pick up a pen and go to the whiteboard. Literally, if I want to move myself out of like, Sukhinder, shut up, and get everybody's thinking in the room and be the scribe. And you're like, as a leader, do you ever think of being the scribe? I bet many of you don't pick up the pen and go to the whiteboard. You think it's somebody else's job. But what if that's the job that gets you to switch off your brain as an author and create room for others to take risks? So that was the last one.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, you and I are probably similar that, our instincts are to take charge and jump in. And so you really have to check yourself. I really try to go last and call on people that maybe don't naturally speak up, just to make sure that we get all the opinions on the table. But you have to build a lot of trust in the team to make that work really well. And that takes investment of time and consistent behavior, so that people don't feel like they're punished in some way or take risks. Okay.
Yeah. So coming
pivot back to the question about the career risk that went awry. What are your thoughts?
Right. So we talked about the one at Polyvore, but I think what's maybe more instructive for people is, so after Polyvore, I was pretty fearful of joining another startup. I had, keep in mind, I'm only actually now a year out of Google and my resume is still pretty good. And so I start getting calls to run big companies, and I think I'm not going to take another. Well, actually, I come out of Polyvore thinking two things. First of all, wow, I don't know that I could afford to do another startup, or I'd want to. And number two, if I ever do another startup again, it will be nothing but my own. I will never take this kind of risk for someone else. If I'm going to take it, I'm only betting on my own moral authority. So there's two kind of dichotomous. It was like, I don't want to do a startup. If I ever do one again, it will only be mine, because I'd been a founder before. And so I start interviewing big jobs. I end up, I think, one of the large travel companies, not the number one player. I think they were the number 3 player, call me, and I'm the top contender for the CEO job. And at the same time, out of Polyvore, despite myself, I start thinking about how much brands want shoppable content, and I'm watching all the haulers on YouTube. And I have an idea that video shopping should exist. I know, everybody, I know this is not new in 2021, but in 2010, nobody was doing it. It was a novel idea. And I'm like, how can this not be? And I saw that, Polyvore, brands want to spend on shoppable content, and yet there's no new age QVC, HSN. You look at those businesses. And so I start parallel processing. I'm interviewing for large jobs, and I write the business plan. I hire an engineer. I interview 12 women. I actually shoot 4 videos in my living room. I have 12 of my friends over, and I show them shoppable videos. Literally, I bought stuff from Nordstrom, and I run a process in parallel. And just as I'm getting the offer to run the large travel company, the validation of this idea is like, these 12 women are like, there's something there. And I've taken it as far as I can take it without raising money, and I turned down the CEO job at the large travel company, and I start Joyous. And for those of you who don't know, Joyous spent 7 years and, 6.5 years building a video commerce platform, pre Instagram video. YouTube is now doing shopping. All the platforms, TikTok, Snapchat, but no commerce existed on any of those rails. And so through blood, sweat, and tears, every year we doubled, and I got it to about 20 million. And we had to literally publish. We created our own patented shoppable video player, and we would put it on publisher sites, and it would convert. But publisher page views were declining. And every time I tried to run shoppable video on Facebook or YouTube, I couldn't get the math to arbitrage. Like, I literally could not get customer acquisition to be low enough, to have a good CAC to LTV. So although we were growing, we kept needing more and more venture. And so by the time the company was, 2016, 2017, I can't get a venture firm to fund it. It's at Series C. It's 20 million. It's like, and the LTV to CAC is just not working.
The lift is too heavy and the burn.
The lift is too heavy, and I'm 6.5 years in. And so I sell it for very little money. And at that point, you say, how do you recover? Like, so what's happened at this point? I've now become an expert at e-commerce, because between Polyvore and my own startup, I know everything there is to know. I use that knowledge and I start investing in other startups at the same time. So at the same time as I'm an entrepreneur, I invest in Stitch Fix and a bunch of others. I joined the board at Urban Outfitters. I keep arbitraging and I keep investing in my e-commerce knowledge. So the good news is, so you're like, well, what happens with that failure? I sell Joyous, and I'm like, I am not doing another startup. I am really not. Now I'm 2
Right.
in. I'm 7 years out of Google. And by the way, I kind of miss scale. So I said, you know what? I'm going to try and pivot my knowledge to take this e-commerce knowledge and my track record and my board experience and whatever, and get a large scale, at scale e-commerce opportunity. And luckily for me, eBay gave me that opportunity to run StubHub. So, that's how I recovered. But when people say, well, Sukhinder, like, okay, you failed up, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, look, I failed twice. Polyvore, then Joyous. That was a 7-year stretch where I had no wins. But remember that 70-20-10. What I tried to do was deepen my knowledge,
Yeah.
apply that knowledge in multiple ways. I joined a board, I was an investor, and that collection of activities and collection of knowledge is what let me into eBay. eBay wanted me for the fact that I had both Google and entrepreneurship. They wanted the fact that I was cutting edge on shopping, even if I was early, right?
Right.
They wanted the combo. They wanted the fact that I was an investor and a board member. It's only the collection of experiences I had at post Google that led me to the StubHub job. Google cred, but honestly, it was 7 years of grinding leadership, in e-commerce that got me the StubHub job. So that's how it works, right? That's my point. Like, it's never a linear path between risk and reward. I'm like, how many choices to get the job at StubHub? I mean, at least 7 or 8. It's not one and done. I got to the job I wanted, but it wasn't a single choice move. It was multiple moves.
I love that, and I think that's so true. And I think that you also, I think, were conscious about your networking and your branding.
Mm-hmm. Very much.
And did a great job of that. And I think that's part of what allowed you to package that collection of experiences in a great way to then, get you to the StubHub job. And obviously many people have recognized your talents and attracted you to their boards since then as well. So they weren't the only ones who noticed. Anyway, well, while we're on this topic, let's talk a little about gender differences in risk taking. And what have you observed? And are there things you think people can do to change the paradigm, whether for men or for women?
Yeah, sure. Well, a couple of things. First of all, before we go to the gender-based stuff, which I'll come to in a moment, I think you hit on one important point. To be a risk taker is not to be rash. To be what we're trying to do is learn to be calculated risk takers, right? And so to be agile in our response. But of course, we want to increase our probabilities of success. And so I am definitely a believer in risk diversification. Like, to your point, I placed multiple bets every day. Like, my highest risk job was like my entrepreneurship job, but then I basically said my lower risk play here is to be a board member, and I'm going to bet on my knowledge by doing some investing. And so I really wanted to your point, take a collection of risks at the same time, because my biggest choice was the riskiest, right? The day job. So coming to women and men, I think that I really wanted to believe when I was writing this book and look at the research that the research would show that men and women are not different on risk taking. I wanted it so badly to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And then I looked at all the research and I found one, and there's so many studies on gender and risk taking, but there's one actually meta-analysis where researchers looked at 150 different studies, and then they categorized all the different studies. On 14 of 16 dimensions of risk taking, women were more risk averse than men. And that's a categorization of 150 different units of research. So unfortunately, it is true. So let's talk about what that means and what else the research says. The research also suggests that in that meta-analysis, the variation or the variance decreases with age. So number one, it does matter when people get more experience. Number two, the research also suggests that context matters greatly, that people are more likely to take risks for situations they value and contexts in which they believe they'll be successful. So as an example, a woman might take more risk when it comes to, I'm just making it up, caregiving choices than her spouse might. A man may take more risk on, I don't know, sports betting because it's a context. Winning in front of his friends is really important and he cares about football. Like, it literally, context matters. That's one other finding that should give us some hope that it's not that just women are less risk takers. It's about what is the context. The second thing that the research suggests is that men are more indiscriminate on risk taking. It literally says men and boys will take more risks even when it's smarter not to take the risk. And women, even on innocuous and good risks, are less likely to take risks.
Yep.
So the conclusion of that study was just simply by virtue of having more at-bats, men are likely to see more successes and more failures, and women are opting out of, making more choices. So I think when we look at gender differences, they exist. I think the other irony of all of this, though, is we know that to create safe environments for others to take risk, women are actually, as leaders, better at it. They're
Yes.
more empathetic, they're more supportive, they build diverse groups. So the irony of all of this is women are probably better at creating environments in which other people can take risk. But the
There's
opportunity,
something
I
deep
mean,
and
that is
unfair
true,
about
right?
that.
If you said to me, would you bet on, I would say, if you asked me, like, look at all the research, I'd say, I'd bet that a man would create an environment in which he takes all the risks, and a woman would a leader might create an environment in which everybody else feels more comfortable to take risks. And the reality is we want both to happen. So gender risk-taking differences do exist, but I think what we need to do and then the last piece of research that's important is, yes, there is research that supports the self-fulfilling prophecy that if women believe they are less perceived as risk-taking, they take risk less. So the first thing we have to do is, at least out of our situations, take out our own bias that we're imposing, where we perceive women as less ambitious, signal that they're less ambitious, signal that they're less risk-taking capable. What I want to do is signal to all of my teams, you are equally capable of taking risks, like
Yes.
equally capable, because what we don't want to do is reinforce a negative bias that, in fact, research shows will make women take less risk. And I think maybe the thing to actively do, and you talked about this, Allan, is, how do you help people who fear taking risk, identify and push them towards possibilities? And we know
Yes.
that with women, this may be pushing them towards possibilities before they're qualified. Number two, it means that you likely, unfortunately, have to play the odds disproportionately in favor of, if you want all your teams to take possibility, you will have to spend disproportionate amounts of your time, just to get women and men taking risks equally. So that means you actually have to fill your pipeline with more than 50% of your effort. You can't just put 50% of effort on everyone.
Right.
You literally will have to, in order to get people being risk takers equally, you will have to put more effort into encouraging your women and potentially diverse groups, though there's very little research on diversity outside of gender.
I couldn't agree more, and I think such an important lesson. I think there's two aspects here, right? There's lifting the general willingness to take risks, which is super important and something that enables everyone, because I think in general humans are biased, not taking enough.
Yep.
And then accommodating and figuring out how to encourage groups that might be even
Less
within
willing.
that less likely. And I think there are gender differences there. There are also differences across race and socioeconomic background. And we've spent a lot of time on that. I'd say we've made much more progress on the gender side than on race, for example. And so that's a huge area that I'm spending a lot of time on as a leader here over the last couple of years, because it's so important, and it's so endemic to succeeding in your career, as you've highlighted in your book. And giving people the safety to do that, and
safety is obviously,
and the coaching and the support to take those risks is one of the most important things we can do as leaders. So
and the other thing we can do, and I think this is equally important, is as leaders, I always say that there's a abundant possibility at work, but it's not equally distributed. And I think as leaders, our job is not only to lift our own groups, but obviously to identify the systemic areas of, possibility inequality and try and solve them, because, our teams can point them out, but it really, unfortunately, takes power and influence to, and you've got to lend power and influence to solve systemic issues of inequality.
Yeah, totally agree. Let's talk about normalizing failure. How should people empowered do that?
It's we talked about celebrating. Everybody says celebrate failure, and
that might be a little over the top, but
it's a little over the top, I think. But I think in terms of normalizing failure, people often, as an example, think about doing like debriefs when a big project fails, and it's almost more like it's not quite a scolding, but we always treat it as like a what went wrong. I don't know how many of us, myself included, maybe enough, incorporate like, hey, what was the hypothesis? Like hypothesis learning, even in the way we run our meetings. Like, I'm always encouraging my teams to sort of have a hypothesis, but I don't know that I always close that feedback loop. I don't even know if I talk that way enough. So I think while we all say celebrate failure, what in truth really happens is something goes really bad, and then there's a big debrief where everybody wants to avoid blame, which is actually not really celebrating failure in the feedback loop. So I think we have to find a way to maybe make hypothesis and learning, maybe it's part of our frameworks and our OKRs, because really we don't even like, I was pushing my teams to like, can we even phrase it hypothesis learning instead of OKR? Like, because I think that's what it takes to normalize it. I think the other thing truly is, and this is probably even more important, for all the stuff we do in planning and meetings, nothing is as powerful as the thing you do without knowing it as a leader, like the tiny tell in a meeting where you validate an action,
Yes.
and you do it in these little ways. And I it's a long ago in my career, or maybe it's not even long ago, I keep relearning in my career that like I want to worry about all the formal communications and the formal planning and the OKR process. And then what people remember, Alan, are stories. Like what
Yes.
people remember are like people come back to me with a story about something I did in my career. I was like, oh, that's what you remember? Like it wouldn't even occur to me. They'll be like, oh, you said this thing in this meeting. And I'm like, and I took it away and I realized that what people remember is stories. So whenever as a leader you're thinking about systematically normalizing failure, I think we can do that in planning, hypothesis, learning, debriefs, whatever. I think maybe the most powerful thing we can all do is like, how are you like today going to do something really little, in a meeting, in a walk around on the floor? Because I can guarantee that the more you sprinkle these little actions, the more people watch and they tell those stories. Um, and I think actually that may be the best thing to normalize failure, because those are stories that are traveling through the office. You may not even be aware they are. And then later somebody comes and tells you. So when you see an opportunity to validate somebody who is taking a little risk, like do it. And by the way, all the better if they're not your direct report, and so find opportunities to, I would say, validate failure and risk taking, not at the level below you. How about 3, 4, 5 levels below you in small and micro actions, because those stories travel in ways you can't imagine.
I completely agree with that. And I think one way to maybe rephrase it is failure is not failure; it's learning.
Yes.
And growing. And I mean, as you told your career story, you did a lot of that, right? And there were some particularly formative moments where you failed, yes, but you learned a tremendous amount, and you became a better leader, and you became the viable candidate to then have the big successes that you've had. And I think that's such an important point. The other point is the corollary of this is it's unhealthy as an organization to only set goals that you can attain.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think give all credit to Larry, who I think say, well, 70% attainment of your OKR should be considered a good score, because he knew that the institutional bias would be to set goals that I can safely attain, so then I can go tell my manager that I attained them. And he tried really to fight that, and I think that was a brilliant insight, and one that we need to hold on to.
I think that's absolutely right. And one last one before we move to questions, which I know we'll do. We talk about celebrating the learnings and the failures. I'm going to challenge everybody on this to move one step earlier in the food chain. I want you to celebrate the little risks, because that means what you're celebrating is the action, regardless of the learning or the outcome. So if you move forward and celebrate a risk somebody took and acknowledge it that way, I think there's something really powerful there, which is like, whatever it is, like, hey, and even to say, I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I love that you I love that we're trying that. I think like that's a great point. I don't know what we should do with it, but like, thank you for making that point, because we have to hold on to this issue that you just raised and figure out a way to come back to it. When people take like micro risks, we want to celebrate the fact that they even took the action when we don't even know what the result will be, failure or success.
Right. And there's a corollary there that sometimes also success can, you mistake causation and causality, right? And so people who happen to be in the right place at the right time look brilliant. may not actually have done anything great. And so there's a tremendous amount of luck involved in being in the right team in the right place.
Yep.
Talk a little about Silicon Valley work culture. It's evolved tremendously, and the time that you and I have been working. What do you see happening? Do you feel like you've played a role in that evolution? What would you like to see happen?
Oh God, I don't know. I think you'd be giving me way too much credit to say I'd play a role in the evolution. I'd like to think I've played some role in Silicon Valley boards. That would be my hope, that the board list has actually, as a platform, has accelerated that momentum, or started it and accelerated it. Here's what I think about work culture. I think that probably the healthiest thing for Silicon Valley in some ways was around work culture was COVID, because it exposed us all to the fact that we have lives outside of work. We saw each other's, and we all sort of started to value our own, holistic capacity. So I think there's something really interesting that's going on with work culture. And as you know, there's a whole new set of tools companies that aren't just about productivity, but about how to make hybrid work. And I just say, like, the thing I find most hopeful is there's finally empathy we have for ourselves and we have for each other about the lives we want to have outside of work. Like, my husband for 20 years was like, "What are you doing commuting to the city?" And I was like, "Simon, this is the cost of work. Like, I don't know what you don't understand about this." And now I'm like, wow, like I don't even understand how I would commute every day anymore. I was like, I have lost so much in those 3 hours. But he could have told me that till he was blue in the face. And I was like, this is the way the world of work is. This is what I need to do to be, a leader, blah, blah, blah. So I would just say that empathy is probably the thing I love most about the world of work. And then, and the thing I'm sad about is, we will lose something in being entirely virtual. So, valuing the human connection, that's a lot of what gives us joy at work. So whatever I do next or run next, there will be a physical component, but I'll find a way to make it work for our teams, because the day of energy we all get from each other is hard to replace on Zoom. So that's what I think about the world of work and where it's headed.
Let's pivot to, we got some great audience questions from the chat. Sure. And I'll pick the first one here from Seema. So I know you're a mom yourself, you've got 3 kids. What is your advice to moms on how they can keep their career on track and prevent derailment during the pandemic, or really even beyond the pandemic?
Yeah, it's so multiple things. So number one, as much as we hate to think of ourselves as having to do this, negotiating it both at work and at home is like essential. Nobody wants to think about their marriage as a negotiation, but every time I made a career choice, and I made several big ones at Google, it was a negotiation at Google and at home. And people at Google, I think, know the stories. I mean, I negotiated very hard at Google to get the support I needed to be able to do an international job with a child. And I negotiated at home, literally, on like how to not get divorced while taking that job, and what my husband and I needed to create in terms of a home structure. So first of all, I hate to say it, but you need to be prepared to like put on the table what you need and negotiate, and that is really important. Number two, and this, and Google is phenomenal in this regard, but we need an infrastructure for care that companies understand and can support. Part of what is, regardless of what you think about a $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill, the most interesting thing about what Biden is doing is, for the first time, creating infrastructure for caregivers, because women disproportionately have that. So first of all, there's what you can negotiate. Number two, it's like what you need your employers to, particularly if they have the capacity to create in terms of, caregiving support. And I think Google has always been, fairly good about having, more choices than less to support, families in these times. And then the third one in that negotiation is, if you need to exit, think about like how you exit, at what level you exit, or what you can negotiate to stay in, and don't presume you can't. I think this is actually, sometimes we make this presumption. Think about that choice set I said. No choice is binary. Exactly. So before, like if I were to take the risk-taking metaphor to this, I'd be like, before you presume you have only one choice, generate 10 choices and go have an active conversation about those 10 choices. And I know there may not be 10 when it comes to women. They may be 3. They may be at home, be at work, something in between, sabbatical, hybrid, but like literally every derivative of the choice, take the time to put it on paper and play them all out before you assume it's not possible.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And to your point, it's not binary. There's a continuum there. Okay, next audience question.
Mhm.
So this is from Mike.
Yeah.
So as a leader, in those moments when you feel some insecurity, do you share those feelings with your teams, or do you instead put on a brave face and fake it till you make it? Or maybe a little of both? It's a great question.
I'll tell you, it depends on what the situation is. I
Right.
think the situations in which I fake it till I make it are the pure crisis situations where, you know, what I believe I need to show people is complete, faith that there is a path and we will find it. Because
Yeah.
in moments of crisis, you just want people to know that there is stability and that and that you are like there, even if you don't have all the answers. So I would say in moments of crisis, I don't show insecurity, even
Right.
though I feel it massively. Mostly in those moments, what I'm trying to show people is like, okay, like I am here. Now let's get into brainstorming mode and figure it out. The places I definitely show insecurity, when it's a hard choice and I don't know what to do when we're not in crisis,
Right.
I am quite happy to be like, hey, I'm not really sure what to do here. But I think, and I think as a leader, that is absolutely fine. I've been times like I don't know what the right choice is, but I think my job as a leader then is to hold everybody's insecurities, including mine, and be like, here's the path we're going to take to figure it out. And I freely admit I might be wrong. Like I freely admit it because I just don't know the answer. And I
Right.
think that when you just don't know the answer, people find, to your point, not just security in that. I think they feel validated that it's okay to not know the answer.
Yeah, no, I think that's very, very, very true. I think on the first point that you made, it's people think that they have to choose between being authentic and transparent and or faking till they make it. I actually think you can combine the two.
Mm-hmm.
You should, of course, acknowledge
Yes.
the situation being dire and the facts that are
Yes.
evident to everybody. The worst thing you can do is to seem like management is out of touch. But at the same time, as you said, the confidence that there is a path and that you can chart it, people need to feel that,
Yes.
particularly at that moment of crisis. So couldn't agree more with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's go to the final audience question. This is from Anna.
Mm-hmm.
So can you give an example of little risks and big risks? What do we mean by that?
Sure. I'll tell you what I mean by that, and I'll tell you how to size them. Little risks for me are like, I will say, like taking a risk to learn something, taking a risk to discover opportunities, like literally showing up at work and deciding that today's going to be the day that you speak to your boss about something that's bothered you, showing up at work and deciding that today's the day you're going to step into the white space because a project is going awry. And you really are like, nobody's owning it. I need to own it. Like literally, it's not in my job description, but if I don't own it, it doesn't get done. Those to me are little risks that we have every day. And those choices are to make an impact. They're little, I usually can define a little risk by like time, energy, maybe a little amount of money, right? Big risks are obviously, I would say bigger career choices. And I think, bigger financial choices. But the way I actually, so sometimes so it's very obvious. Little risks are like daily risks, bigger risks are things that are choices that are that you need to make for a 1, 3, 5-year time frame, right? Not choices you need to make for a day or a week. So you can time bound it. But the other big way to tell something's a little risk or a big risk for yourself when you think something's a big risk is think about the one-way door or the two-way door. And what I mean by this is most people think, yes, this is right. This comes straight from Jeff Bezos. I would say if you can take a risk, if you can make a choice and it fails, and after that you can come right back and be just as good as before, that's called a two-way door. If you make a choice and literally after that, there is no path back and there is very limited choices forward, you are in one-way door territory, and that's what's called a bigger risk, right? But even things we think of as big risks, like I chose to change a career. The reality is going to Polyvore was a big risk, okay, because I walked away from financial security. I would even say, though, it was a medium risk, even though it was gigantic to me, because I probably could have come back to Google. I probably could have found another big job, right? But it was so massive because it was stepping off a large platform to go to a small one. So I just think that we all need to be sizing our risks. And I think what we really want to do is get in the habit of like little risks, like instead of fearing them, just take more of them, because that's how you become a calculated risk taker and get ready for the medium and bigger size risks.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think the reversibility point is so important, and getting maybe some third party perspective on that last point, since people tend to have a very exaggerated view of how irreversible their career decisions are.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
I think that's the big one.
Yes, very, very good. Well, that was just absolutely fantastic. I'm proud to be your friend. Congratulations on your book, everyone. You can order it on Amazon. This is what it looks like. It really is excellent. And thank you so much for spending an hour with us.
Oh, so happy to do it. And as I said, my heart is always as a Googler. So it's really fun to be able to do this talk.
Well, it was an honor to have you, and congratulations.
Thanks, Allan.
Thank you.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Bye-bye.